and a student of International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS. I'm co-moderating today's webinar with my friend and colleague Vaishnavi. Over to you, Vaishnavi.
Thank you so much, Varsha. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Vaishnavi, and I'm also a project assistant at Scrap Weapons, and I'm also doing my master's degree in International Studies and Diplomacy from SOAS. It's really great to have you all here for the second webinar of our series on feminist leadership and disarmament. This is our second year implementing this webinar series, and this year we'll be looking more closely at the Women, Peace and Security agenda that was formally established in the year 2000 through the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and Feminist Foreign Policy. The idea is to discuss these two agendas and projects and their relationship with establishing or not general and complete disarmament, which Scrap Weapons is intrinsically connected to. Today, our topic of discussion will be feminist theoretical approaches to WPS and feminist foreign policy, and we will explore the extent to which advances in the WPS agenda and feminist foreign policy have aligned with feminist perspectives and ideologies which had pushed for their existence. Today, we're honored to be joined by three fantastic speakers, Ray Acheson, Kirthi Jayakumar, and Laila Aldoaat. Just before we start, I want to run through a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the Scrap YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And once all our speakers have given their presentations, we will open up the floor for an audience Q&A sessions. So please add your questions via the Q&A function. And if possible, it would be great to have your name and affiliation. You can start leaving questions right away. Now I'll hand it back over to Varsha to introduce Scrap Weapons in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. So scrap weapons, or the strategic concept for removal of arms and proliferation, aims to reframe the debate around disarmament and to challenge the dominant strategic culture of production, trade, and supply of weapons that inevitably fosters new wars and which has a direct impact on safety and development conditions of critical areas of the global south. The threat of global war looms, yet there is no practical strategy for weapons control. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and use of nuclear threats have horrified the world and emphasized the risk inherent to proliferation of conventional arms and nuclear weapons. Before this, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that governments have failed to invest sufficiently in public health infrastructure while prioritizing spending on military modernization, procurement, and operations. In these unprecedented times, we appeal to states and others to harness their capabilities to achieve collective security through cooperative international agreements by reinvigorating efforts to achieve sustainable, verified, and irreversible disarmament. We call on states, including our governments and their representatives, to support the activation of a fourth special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly. You can read more about our call and the Scrap Weapons Conference in September 2022, which will seek to build a constituency working towards the implementation of a fourth special session at the link that will be posted in the chat. And we also invite everyone, as well as your partner organizations, to support this initiative by signing our call for a fourth special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly using the form also provided in the chat. Now over to you, Vaishnavi.
Thank you. So without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker of the day, Ray Acheson. Ray Acheson is a visiting researcher from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where they lead the disarmament program Reaching Critical Will. The WILP was founded in 1915 to challenge militarism, patriarchy, and capitalism as root causes of war. Ray continues this work today by bringing an intersectional feminist approach to disarmament and anti-war activism. They represent the organization on the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. In 2021, Ray published a book titled Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. And so, Ray, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks for organizing this series of webinars and inviting us to speak today from, I think, some critical perspectives on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, as it's known, and also feminist foreign policy, which is sort of, and in some ways has emerged from the WPS agenda and the work that's been done for so long in the UN space. But I think what's important in terms of bringing feminist perspectives to bear on these two frameworks for action is that we need to be critical of how these frameworks have been used so far and what they've actually been able to do in terms of advancing peace and justice in the world, bringing gender equality, etc. And so I think there's some problems with both the WPS and Feminist Foreign Policy frameworks that I'd like to talk about today, specifically in relation to disarmament and arms control issues. Women, peace, and security back in the late 90s, when it was being promoted in the lead up to the UN resolution, I think a lot of the feminists working on this at the time really had the idea that this would be an instrument that would help prevent war, that it would be a critical framework to engage with the violence of war, and to work directly against some of the political and economic and social structures that support war. But what's happened since the 1325 resolution and all of its subsequent resolutions have been adopted is that in many instances, WPS has really become more about promoting women's participation in war. So whether as military officers or soldiers or peacekeepers, and also trying to protect women in war, as opposed to protecting people from war, as in preventing war, which would be to protect everybody. Recognizing the gendered impacts of war or the use of specific weapons like small arms or explosive weapons, etc., or recognizing that women's experiences are different in war. These are all important developments that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has really helped to generate and normalize in terms of UN action and government action. But unfortunately, it's also been framed as sort of tweaking war to make it safer for women, or adding women into the war machine, which doesn't really help make war safer, and it doesn't help prevent war. It might help reduce specific forms of violence or draw attention to specific forms of violence in the long term, but it doesn't change the actual structure of war and violence, of weaponization, of military budgets. So, for example, the United States has been promoting women's participation through its, partly through its 1325 national action plans, but also just in general, its military industry celebrates gender diversity or gender equity in its war machine. So there's an all-woman missileer force at the Mino Air Force Base, for example. So it doesn't mean that these women are in there critiquing the system of nuclear weapons, or calling for disarmament or challenging some of the thinking around nuclear deterrence. It just means that being a woman doesn't mean you can't destroy the entire planet. And they're quite proud about this. They have their own insignia and badges and promote themselves through different forms of media. And I think, it's a great example of just the inclusion question of what Women, Peace, and Security has brought us, because it's celebrated as a victory for women's equality. I think also another good example is the 5 of the CEOs of the major weapons manufacturers in the US have all recently been women as well. So I think there's something to look at here when it comes to this form of participation, which is also reflected in feminist foreign policy that I'll get to in a moment, where there's this form of kind of liberal feminism, the sort of smash the glass ceiling feminism, but it doesn't look at where those glass shards fall and who's not included in this advancement of women. So it's largely, a white woman empowerment in a corporate structure type of approach to equality, war profiteering being equal opportunity, gender equitability in war profiteering and weapons manufacturing, and now also turning beyond just the sort of women peace and security and really looking and embracing intersectionality and turning that into the service of empire too. So I don't know if any of you have seen, but the CIA recently had a recruitment ad, which was, featuring a queer Latinx woman, very proud to be recruiting for the CIA. So there's this co-option that happens within these narratives that we need to be, I think, very mindful of in terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion, which is super important, but it shouldn't be about tokenism, right? It shouldn't be about having someone in the room in order to reinforce that, oh, everyone agrees with our agenda and shutting out alternative perspectives, but actually allowing different experiences and perspectives and ideas to inform and change policy. Not just looking for a seat at the table that then silences us, but overturning that table, building new tables, building new spaces in which to operate. And it's not, the language of empowerment I always struggle with as well, because it's, why do we have to empower people if we have equality, right? It sort of doesn't make any sense. We should all be able to have the same access, but of course we don't. And so that's where this language of empowerment comes from. And then it's turned against us again once we're inside in order to silence us and ensure that we conform to the dominant narrative and dominant ways of thinking about things. So empowerment shouldn't just be about participation, but actually enabling us to change things from the outside and the inside. And we can see very clearly what happens when the table is different. We have some great examples of this. And I think one of the best that's very close to my heart is the example of banning nuclear weapons. The nuclear armed states did not come to those negotiations. So, and their nuclear supportive allies like the NATO members. And so to not have them in the room imposing their dominant view and making us feel as either as global South diplomats or as activists from around the world, usually they make us feel like we're privileged to be in the room. But instead we controlled that room. They weren't there. It was our room. And we were able to develop the best global instrument that we have on nuclear weapons to date. And we were able to work together in new and innovative ways and really collaborate across regions and in terms of the collaboration between activists and organizers and the Red Cross and government officials. So there's all kinds of things you can do once you've set up that new table or once you've shifted the power dynamic in these spaces. And from there, I think it's a good place to talk about feminist foreign policy, because I'm very worried that feminist foreign policy in many ways, I think, was, again, the way the women, peace and security agenda as its origin story was supposed to be quite radical and transformative and approaching the world differently and really upending a lot of the dominant structures of politics and economics and the way the world works, right? It was supposed to confront all of that in the minds of those who really thought this project through. But I see it largely as going the same direction as the women, peace and security agenda has gone, being used to, again, promote equality in terms of women's participation, and in both of these agendas, often bearing down on the binary of men and women and not including LGBTQ voices and perspectives and identities. And the feminist foreign policy also isn't really enabling a change to the policies beyond certain approved parameters that are acceptable within the sort of structure of violence and war and empire and everything else that we are trying to confront. So more money might be made available for empowering women or for providing for women's maternal health, et cetera. That's a big part of, for example, Canada's alleged feminist foreign policy. And that's not to say that those programs, initiatives, et cetera, aren't helpful, useful, important. But when it's put in contrast to other, say, Canadian policies of profiting from weapons sales to the most misogynist government on the planet, Saudi Arabia, or imposing other structural adjustments on countries through international financial institutions that actually harm women and harm everybody else in those countries, then we have to have a bigger picture of where the feminist foreign policy fits in. And so the example of Canada that I just gave is a good one. I think Germany and Sweden, Germany just announced its increase of its military budget, 100 billion euros to militarism. Sweden's looking at military budgets, increasing its military budgets as well. And of course, this is in response to what's happening right now with Ukraine and the sort of the narratives that we're seeing coming out of this conflict of, well, militarism is the only solution to the problem of militarism and war. So really doubling down on that, as opposed to allowing feminist principles, perspectives, approaches, ways of working, and diversity in all of its forms actually having an influence on these foreign policy decisions. Another great example of this mismatch between feminist foreign policy and reality is with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So all of these governments that I mentioned that have allegedly feminist foreign policies, Canada, Germany, Sweden, they all reject the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They all support NATO having nuclear weapons and a NATO war planning doctrine, even at this time where it's very clear that we are once again at grave risk of a nuclear war. And so instead of accepting that nuclear weapons pose this planetary threat to all of us, they're doubling down again trying to double down again on the need for nuclear weapons and the value of nuclear deterrence, even as these myths are being very visibly challenged quite publicly in this moment. And so I think for us as feminists, part of our job, of course, is always to challenge this dominant narrative and to expose it for what it is, which is a frame that of militarism, of war profiteering, that doesn't actually lead us towards anything that the women, peace and security or the feminist foreign policy agendas say they want to achieve. And so exposing the double standards, exposing the ways in which these policies, as they are actually enacted, work against the things that they're said they're supposed to achieve, and looking at where the money is going in reality to achieve, whether it's gender justice or women's empowerment or whatever it is that they say they want to achieve, is really important in this moment. And that's something that, as feminists, we are very used to having to do constantly. And so that there is this role for us in this moment of not letting go of feminist principles just because it's hard, or letting go of peace just because it's hard and the voices against it in this moment are so loud. But if we've opposed wars since 1915, since our founding during World War I. And so for us, coming at it from that consistent opposition to violence and the structures of war helps provide, I think, guidance to all of us, no matter who is engaged in, the war of the moment. So I think I'm going to stop there, and interested to hear what others have to say.
Thank you so much, Ray, for that insightful session. I particularly liked how you took a run through down history about how initially we had to prevent war, and then the dynamics changed to actually protecting women in war. Now again, about bringing in more intersectionality, and particularly this chord. Why do we have to empower people if we have equality? So thank you so much, Ray, for all insights. So it's time for us to move on to our next speaker. So I will now introduce Kirthi Jayakumar. She is a feminist researcher working in the areas of women, peace and security, transitional justice, and feminist foreign policy. She founded and runs the Gender Security Project, one of the few WPS centers in the Global South, which works at the cusp of gender, security, peace, and conflict through research, reportage, and documentation. Over to you, Kirthi.
Thank you, Varsha. Thank you, Scrap, for inviting me to share a few thoughts and also to have the unparalleled experience of sharing this space with Ray and Laila, both of whom I look up to. So the WPS agenda establishes its key actionable points on 4 key themes: protection of women, prevention of sexual violence in armed conflict contexts, enhanced participation of women in peace processes, and relief and recovery. So the WPS agenda, when it emerged in the form of a resolution, effectively arrived on the backs of and lived experiences of women in the majority world. As revolutionary and pioneering as it was when it emerged, has it remained true to its feminist goals today? Has the idea of a feminist foreign policy, which in some ways has arisen from the WPS agenda, been truly feminist in its implementation? I argue that the WPS agenda and feminist foreign policy, as we know it in the present form, have the potential to be transformational. But if we want to create a feminist future, a feminist reality, we really need to take a deep look at some of the challenges that are inherent in the way the agenda has been implemented. And perhaps the lawyer in me wants to also look at how the agenda has been shaped in itself in terms of the language used and what that language has then carried forward in its implementation. Now, the first biggest challenge that stands out to me in the WPS agenda is the limited framing of the idea of a woman. Now, in spite of having opened up room for a conversation for the first time in the world on how sexual violence and armed conflict was not a byproduct of war, but a careful war tactic, a lot of these conversations did not go beyond the conventional framing of women, that of victims in need of protection or agents in need of participation in war. So even as Resolution 1325 ascribed victimhood to women, later resolutions did come on board, definitely, admittedly, to call for a discursive representation of women as actors, agents, and worse still, as superheroines even. Now, for all the doors that it did open, 1325 and the subsequent resolutions that followed were carefully drafted with the aim of getting a foot in the door in an otherwise boys' club situation that security spaces traditionally were. And the pursuit thereon became one of strategic essentialism over inclusive feminist language in its text and pursuing a larger feminist goal of dismantling the entire institution of war, as it were. So the decision to pursue an essentialist strategy automatically came at a cost. It failed to acknowledge personal positions, conditions, contexts, and their interactions with gender, which create very unique experiences of armed conflict. So instead of arguing for gender equality or women's rights or dismantling war in itself, 1325 went right back to either calling women agents that needed to be protected in war or needed to be co-opted into the entire war machinery instead of pursuing a feminist aim. And inclusion then became about adding women and stirring. So this led to a marked absence of intersectionality, which has tremendous implications on ground. And that's the second challenge I want to point out today. Now, in its focus on women, of course, the idea of who a woman is diverse. And that diversity has been completely sidelined in the agenda. In homogenizing women into a monolith, the absence of intersectionality means that the translation of the resolution on ground inherently oppresses some and privileges some. So the agenda does not acknowledge the inherent presence of privilege and oppression in the communities and societies it is aimed at addressing. And without acknowledging and centering the lived experiences of war, the resolutions produce a racialized hierarchy by pitting the international community against the conflict zone and reproducing the racialized, sexualized, and gendered hierarchies of colonialism. I want to take a moment to reference Nicola Pratt, whose work has been very seminal in shifting my mind in understanding the WPS agenda. And she talked about how the agenda effectively results in a resexing of gender that reproduces racialized hierarchies among women. So while service women or women in the army or the police forces are seen as saving women of color, those women of color are seen as victims of men of color in need of protection from the international community. And this has paved the way for pinkwashing and homonationalism, all forms of rationalizing military intervention or military solutions in the context of conflicts happening outside of powerful nations. So this re-racing of race implies that women of color do not fall in line with the UN's idea of women. Now, Sherry Gibbings talks about how Iraqi women who did not speak positively about women's efforts in the reconstruction of Iraq, who called out the invasion by the US and the UK as imperialism and critiqued the UN for its lack of support, were labeled as angry by the United Nations and sidelined. Now, the WPS agenda reflects in process then views of feminist concerns and experiences with respect to violence, with respect to the women in need of protection, with respect to women who have to be co-opted into the army to be seen as powerful. Now, women's lived experiences of peace and conflict are as varied as chalk and cheese. This room represents the diversity of experiences of peace, as it were. Now, the experiences of armed conflict, in the words of Cynthia Enlow, are largely a product of how women are socially identified and how they're treated as members of particular social groups in those societies. And this experience is constituted through an intersection of several systems, and recognizing this will truly broaden the understanding of what gendered harm looks like in armed conflict contexts. Now, the third point that I want to take as an extension from here as a challenge is the conflation of gender and women within the WPS agenda. Now, sexual violence and armed conflict cannot be understood without deconstructing the meanings of sex and gender. The two are not the same and haven't been the same forevermore. But the WPS agenda tends to conflate the two, and in doing that, it binarizes gender and suggests that the gendered impacts of armed conflict is exclusively restricted to a heteronormative experience. So the idea of women automatically means that women cannot be diverse. The idea of women then automatically means that sex and gender within the WPS agenda are conflated to the detriment of women who don't fall within the cis-het norm cookie cutter type. And this is a problematic automatic exclusion that then produces its own effects, automatically amplifying what has been found as structural violence in peace contexts. Now, relatedly within the WPS agenda, justice is not a priority. Now, even as gender analyses and the recognition of challenges that women face in conflict arrived with the intervention of the judiciary, Navneetam Pillai's work in the ICTR blew the cover on the prevalence of sexual violence and armed conflict as a careful strategy, followed by several decisions by the ICTY. The incorporation of justice as a priority within the WPS agenda is absent. And in the process, we do not call into question the challenges that come with choosing peace over justice, choosing amnesty for leadership, and forcing women to go back to communities where they might meet their perpetrators on a daily basis, forcing women to choose a single idea of justice, or forcing survivors to recount their narratives one too many times for the international community with no end in sight and no remedy in sight whatsoever. Moving over to the participation dimension. One big challenge, as I've already mentioned before, is the co-optation of women into positions within the military industry complex. So participation is acceptable if you have an all-women peacekeeping mission that goes away from your country to serve in another country in need of peace, while you have on your hands bloodied, red-handed involvement in militarizing, perhaps holding responsibility for one of the most militarized zones in the world. Now, tokenized participation of women, on the other hand, marks and is characteristic of most peace processes. By excluding women as agents in shaping the peace process, in defining, as Ray said, what the table should really look like, women are forced to be part of a patriarchal agency that continues to reproduce patriarchal hierarchies. And in the process of excluding women, there are also an automatic presupposition that the idea of just checking a box in presenting women in the table is enough to have done the part to include them in a peace process. It's enough to have done to include them and their voices in determining the outcome of the peace process. Now, the final challenge that I'd like to place here is that the WPS agenda has deviated from a feminist understanding of a solution to an armed conflict. Now, Resolution 1325 did talk about the idea of making women part of peace processes. It did talk about including women in processes of producing peace, as it were, in their communities. But it did not do anything to talk about war as an institution that should be dispensed with. It did not do anything to talk about the structural violence and systemic forms of oppression that prevail in peacetime that go on to inform structures like war and normalize situations of war as well. By shifting the onus of protecting women onto states, the agenda has then become an instrument in the hands of powerful states to just make war safer for women. There hasn't been any active attempt to really question what these engagements look like, what hierarchies of colonialism are reproduced in the process of these engagements. Now, armed conflict and peace cannot be divided into watertight compartments. Even though we may be living in what we perceive as peaceful times, we truly aren't free or peaceful. Our inclusion in the systems that run our state is very often minimal, to say the least. But structural violence needs to be addressed in peacetime for us to make meaningful changes in the context of armed conflict. And the inclusion of a feminist vision is vital to be able to do that. Going back to Cynthia Enlow's words, and I'll end with this, the heavy focus on conflict also ignores the fact that formal peace can support and aggravate power differences and inequalities. If we don't start from dismantling those power differences and inequalities in what we know to be peacetime, we're only going to risk reproducing them multiple times over in conflict.
Thank you so much for that powerful presentation, Kirthi. I think there was so much to take away from it, but I think the bottom line for me is that how you explained why at the time Resolution 1325 was regarded as very revolutionary, but 22 years down the road, we see that it's actually limiting, restricting, and kind of re-racing and resexualizing many binaries and many stereotypes and myths that have persisted since the beginning of time. And I also love the emphasis that you placed on centering lived experiences, because those are the ones that matter the most in terms of conflict. So thank you very much, Kirthi. We truly enjoyed your presentation. I would like to introduce our final speaker, Laila Aldoaat. Laila Aldoaat is a human rights lawyer specialized in international law of armed conflicts and the human rights of women, with 15 years of experience in litigation and advocacy. She holds a BA in law and LLM in human rights, conflict, and justice, and is a qualified trainer of international humanitarian law. Laila serves as the Deputy Secretary General at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and sits on the governance and advisory boards of several local and international human rights organizations, trusts, and foundations. Over to you, Laila.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Scrap for organizing this and for inviting me. It's always an honor to engage with you and to be back at SOAS. It's quite dangerous to speak after Bray and Kirthi, because I'm working at the danger of adding absolutely nothing new. So consider this as a small summary of everything they have said. The WPS agenda faces primary challenges, and we need to look at these challenges before we need to look at what is it that we are aiming to achieve. Sometimes, as Shrey and Kirthi said, we are aiming to achieve very different things by the agenda. Us as feminist activists and different actors who use this on a daily basis, we need to at least agree on the intersection of what we are aiming to achieve. So if we are looking at a more peaceful, more feminist, more just world, and the WPS agenda to be a tool to arrive to that, then I can reduce the our criticism of it into three main streams. The first one is about the patriarchal, colonial, and political underpinnings of the agenda. The second one is on militarization and militarism, and what does that mean? How did that transform the agenda, or lack of attention to these issues transform the agenda over the years? And the third issue is the lack of accountability for implementation. So let me start by speaking about participation and representation, the first pillar that rings to a lot of those who use the agenda. And obviously participation is important, it's essential. We have the feminist argument that bringing women to decision-making spaces and to the peace processes is important. It'll create a different peace. But let's remember something. A patriarchal table and a patriarchal peace process, and one that's done in a world order which is based on colonial theories and based on patriarchal thinking, will not change by adding women to it. Men at these tables are always happy to have a few women who look like them, sound like them, and say what they want to hear. There'll always be a place for that. And if we are looking for feminist change, we need to make sure that we don't end up settling for this. The structure of the peace process and how we arrive to the fact of having a peace process is really, really important. We've been engaged in several peace processes over the past 10 years. And what doesn't make it to the news and what doesn't make it into the achievement harvest at the end is all the consuming struggles that women activists and feminist activists go through until the photo op comes, and there's always people at the photo op. But until you arrive to there, there's a serious struggle on what counts as the peace process. Is it the design and the implementation and the assessment and identifying what's needed, or is it that table and the decision that comes after it? Our colleagues from Bosnia can tell you a lot about reducing the peace into an agreement and what happens when that happens. And I can tell you from the many experiences we've been involved in that after 10 years of fighting for an equitable table, even if we reduced our ask to a table that reflects a society, we could very well end up with one where the decisions are made. There has been quotas about militias. I'm just trying to remember the word they used to refer to their legitimacy. They demanded quotas of how much land they control in a particular country, and they controlling 15% of the land gives them 15% of the table, of their seats at the table. That conversation could include women, and it'll mean absolutely nothing. It's departing us from a feminist agenda and from any solution that could be meaningful to women in any way. So a lot of issues with the Security Council's approach to participation, particularly when does the peace process start? There's so much participation on, so much focus on looking at the participation, who sits at the table. What about what we refer to as peacetime, all the time that has happened until this war has been identified as so, or the conflict has been identified as so. And what about the participation in that? We work in conflict countries where suddenly the whole international community is literally digging for women, ideally who speak English, ideally who have visas, and ideally who are available to travel at the drop of a hat, to be at a table or at a meeting with stakeholders when it becomes international news, with absolutely failure to support the existence of a feminist movement and a feminist work, and allowing governments to suppress and to fight and to minimize the work and effect of these groups in peacetime. And suddenly we want them to spring into action and be ready and have 10 years of fight in them to fulfill what the international community demands at that point of time. So the agenda needs to start at peacetime, and our thinking of women's role and of a feminist transformation needs to be transforming peacetime and how we think of it. Also, there seems to be too much focus on participation and strengthening the role of women in governmental structures, and that's obviously important. But a governmental structure that is based on oppressing feminist change would not change by the presence of women. The amount of times I've seen decision makers congratulating themselves because they are represented by women at the state level, or congratulating others because they sent a woman to meet them, is hideous. And I'm only repeating what Trey and Kirthi already said, and I will quote Cynthia Aruza, who says, this way of thinking, the liberal feminist thinking, it asks ordinary people to be grateful that it's a woman, not a man, who burst their unions and ordered drones to kill their their parents or lock their children in cages at the borders. We need to be very careful of identifying with this. And obviously there's so many feminisms out there, and there's so many ways, and all gains are gains to somebody, and I appreciate that. But there are some gains to a very small group of people that is a huge loss to the majority of women around the world, and we need to be careful of supporting that. Back to participation, there's also lastly on the obsession with the table. Even at that, we're losing the amount of special envoys who are congratulating themselves, announcing themselves as champions of women inclusion, and then when you come to quantify what they've done, it's roles that are very vivid and roles that limited consequences, let's put them. So we're talking about observers, advisors. We don't know. So what are you championing? They're championing women in the process, not at the table. If they're at the table, they limiting how consequential their presence are. We need to challenge that, and we need to create some ways of accountability. And I'm going to get to the accountability at the end. So absolutely, we need to strengthen participation. We need to have a feminist analysis and a feminist push to a participation that matters to the majority of women, and that creates a space where there's feminist solutions rather than expanding the issues that are entirely undermining feminist agendas in their diversity. That also is very relevant to supporting local actors, local feminist actors, into having agendas. I'm going to only echo what Kirthi already said. There will always be money and funds and support to empower some sort of women's services, to reduce a feminist agenda into, and nothing against women's services. They're very, very important. They do not fulfill the role of pushing a feminist agenda, of producing knowledge and acknowledging what knowledge matters and taking it forward, and stopping what is limiting this feminist action. We have seen in conflict countries so many fantastic women theorists and women activists and people who are craving to set a feminist agenda for change, in completely being diverted into providing basic living services for the victims, and that's important, but there is a big gap. We need, as both all actors nationally and internationally, and we need to push international actors to make sure that this space for pushing a feminist agenda continues to exist and is not overtaken by the uncontroversial service provision and otherwise. I also need to stress that an actual critical mass of feminist thinking is needed. We need to use mechanisms that are already existent. We need to work within political parties, within trade unions, within mechanisms that could challenge this hierarchical space and work within them, acknowledge that they impact. There is a lot of really important research about the quota system of political parties in Iraq, where it failed, where it could have worked, and what feminist organizations have been pushing for and what eventually got accepted and where we are with that. So it's important to look at these mechanisms, and while we are combating patriarchy, we need to combat the other factors that empower it, particularly capitalism. I'm not going to add a lot on militarization because Dre covered that really well. I just wanted to highlight the on military spending, and we need to connect that to accountability. There needs our partners across regions in conflict or directly impacted by conflict keep asking a very simple question about the lack of accountability around the agenda. When the agenda was created, it was at the core of a human rights approach, and this has been divided over the years, and we need to create this link again. The CEDAW committee regularly asks for reporting on the WPS commitments. The states create national action plans and fall short of solidifying their commitments underneath them, and we need to create accountability mechanisms, and we need to expand these accountability mechanisms to look at actions that are actively countering the security and the peace and the impact of that on women. So exactly what Ray said about military spendings, we need to make sure that through accountability and clear accountability mechanisms, that the commitment to the WPS agenda is not used to pinkwash what is at core super colonial, super capitalist, and genuinely does not care about the safety and security of most women. I'm not gonna say any more about women in the military, because that has been covered really well, and we have absolutely no evidence that it would work. But I want to talk about two things quickly. The first one is the agenda's complete failure in acknowledging foreign occupation as a threat to women, peace and security. There's absolutely no reference to foreign occupation. Despite a huge body of evidence, there's an the agenda and the resolutions around it completely overlooked the impact of the Israeli occupation on Palestinian women. And it's very unfortunate that it had to be another invasion and what's happening in Ukraine today to bring the language on women, peace and security versus invasion and occupation into the legal discussion again. It's absolutely evident an occupation needs an appetite to sustain it. We have that evident in Palestine, and it needs to be at the core of the WPS agenda. So it continues to be relevant. It's minimizing the ability of those impacted by occupation to have any belief in the agenda or to be able to use it. So that's both a normative and a practical conversation that needs to be brought to the center again. And lastly, the colonial approach to the WPS agenda. And perhaps that wasn't the aim when it started and all the activism that created it, but we're definitely there now. I can quote, I've brought a lot of quotes, which I'm not going to take you through now, where countries in the global north say, and I'm quoting, that they have done WPS to Afghani women. That's not a slip, that's how they think of it. They go and WPS the hell out of these women out there. And it's really important. That connects to the failure to look at what happens inside in countries and regionally and in groups in the global north, and completely disconnected from the WPS agenda. So I can produce the arms, sell them, and fail to hold my politicians and politicians around the world accountable for abusing them. And then at the end, I'll totally bring a couple of brown women to the table, and I'll totally send them funding to bring peace to that foreign country out there where there's sad people who are fighting. This disconnect needs to end, and the mentalities that created it and the mentalities that still tolerated need to stop, and we need to have some critical reflection on that. And it's very difficult for navigating this practical versus ethical positioning that groups in the global south really want to put themselves in is very difficult at times. A quick example: once a fantastic activist from the north of Syria said in a meeting that she has been combating violent extremism very long before the West have coined it as a thing and created a lot of funding to support it. So don't come and tell me to combat violent extremism, because I do it, and I do it in a way that actually works. And you are risking that to create ways that don't work anymore, and that exactly what Kirthi said, that identify the extremism as an issue that brown women are doing to brown men are doing to brown women, and suddenly it just needs some international actors to come and save them. So it is one example, and there's many of these where we need to look at the knowledge on the impact and the organizations and what they actually want to do and the role that they actually want to play, and stop this forced direction of local efforts into fitting of a very uniform international understanding of what peace and what security is and how to deal with it. There's so much depth and so much wealth of knowledge that does work that we overlook because of a very, very narrow vision. Definitely encourage organizations and theorists in the global north to have an inward-looking approach to women, peace and security, linking it to disarmament would definitely help hugely. And also that applies to a class dimension and to the feminization of poverty, and suddenly the empowerment and the critical analysis of empowerment that Trey was speaking about, and how it is suddenly we want to empower women when we were absolutely fine with all the factors that impoverished them, that created a feminized poverty that we know, we support, we take forward, and we look the other way from. And then when this creates the kind of polarization and kind of agony that push very close to a conflict, then we want to take some tokenistic empowerment and tokenistic, both economic and otherwise. That's seriously a problem. We need to look at it from the root causes. I'm gonna stop here. On accountability. There has been a huge body of research on making this accountability both legal, so clear legal ways of creating accountability, but also creating platform where there is space for the local activism in the global south to hold international organizations, the multilateral agencies and governments accountable for the short-term and long-term impact of what has been imposed on them and on their activism. We just need to create the space for these conversations to happen. We cannot go on while a lot of well-intended actors think they are doing well and think they are doing really, they think that they are actually saving women in the global south. It just takes, I believe that a lot of people who are causing harm could cause less harm if we created a space for reflection. So let's work on that from a perspective of accountability, continue to seek, it's a little bit more stronger than feedback, but joint reflection in the movement of what we're doing and are we causing harm as we do it. And we all could at one point. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laila. It was such a wonderful presentation. And especially thank you for highlighting the structural issues based on lived experiences and all your work. And let it be about participation and representation or accountability, how still patriarchal attitudes control women's participation in the whole WPS agenda. And also giving women representation is seen as something that is to be congratulated rather to be considered as normal. And also, you also highlighted a lot of gaps that is existing in the literature that is about the foreign occupation and its impact on women's peace and security, and how even in 2022, there still prevails a colonial approach to the WPS agenda. So thank you so much, Laila, for that. And thank you all the speakers. Now the floor is open to questions. So we have a question from Anna. What are the personal obstacles you face, particularly owing to your gender? What advice would you like to share with young women planning to embark a career in disarmament and security affairs? I think this question is open to all speakers. However, I would love to start with you, Laila.
Oh, it's a difficult one. Where do I start? I'm Syrian. I have gone through 10 years of conflict in Syria. If there's one thing I'd advise is we need to use the spaces available to us to continue to expand conversations rather than narrowing them. All I could think around the Ukraine conflict now, the invasion of Ukraine, is the amount of fantastic Ukrainian activists who are going to be put in a corner and asked really tiny, narrow, yes/no question: would you like the NATO to hit, or would you like the NATO not to hit? And denied the opportunity to widen the conversation and widen the space. And that applies to career discussions, to space discussion. We need to use all the spaces available to us to widen the conversation, so people, us and others, don't end up in a very, very narrow yes, no, fail situation. And I apply that to myself, and I hope to contribute to spaces that allow it to happen to others. So making these spaces happen in our activism, in our work, in our life, and linking it to the root causes. That's what we do really well, I hope, in WILF, is that looking at the root causes and not letting these individual conflicts push us into being complicit with these yes/no, very tight, very narrow circumstances. And that applies both in our individual endeavors and also collective in activism.
Kirthi, would you like to add to that?
And I must be honest to say that I actually took advice from Laila and what she just shared. But the one thing I would say, as somebody who's also still finding her way in this space, whether you choose to be a lawyer, a doctor, or somebody in disarmament and security affairs, you are going to encounter the patriarchy. Part of your ability to acquire knowledge in this space is tied to your privilege, and part of your mobility in this space is tied to your privilege. So it's important for you to spend time introspecting and reflecting on what pieces of your privilege might create oppressions for others, and how you can call in inclusion while calling out systems and structures. I am a great fan of being an iconoclast. I don't believe in conforming to patriarchal structures. So wherever you can dismantle structures, go forth and do it.
Thank you, Kirthi. And Ray, what are your views on the same?
Yeah, it's hard to add to those two pieces of advice, but I think to expand on something Laila said about widening the scope of the conversation, when you're in those spaces at the patriarch's table, as it were, the pressure to conform is very strong. And so as hard as it is, and not at all to diminish how hard it is, because it's really hard, not conforming is very, very important. Chances are there are other people in the room who are thinking the same critical things that you're thinking, and they're just not brave enough to say it, or they don't think that they have the right to say it, or they don't have the right words to say it. If you start talking and saying voicing an alternative perspective in the ways that Laila was talking about, or that Kirthi was talking about, then other people, even if they don't back you up in the moment, will invariably come up to you afterwards and say, I'm really glad that you said that, and that needs to be part of the conversation. And the more you do it, the more you refuse to conform in those types of pressure situation, the easier it does get, but it's never easy.
Thank you, Ray. So now we have a question from Jack. Feminist foreign policy and foreign policy in general are still seen as the exclusive remit of the state. What role do individual feminists, NGOs, civil society actors, and non-state actors play in bringing about a feminist foreign policy, aside from advocating, especially in states or countries which need it the most? Speakers.
I can maybe share an idea on this. I think collectively we need to re-own our right to ethical terror, to being terrorized ethically by things. I think we have been so violently pulled to the center, and I'd even argue that we're pulled to the right in our daily interactions in this country. In the UK, the Parliament speaks about food banks as endearing, and we're just losing our ability to be terrorized by things. We're losing our space and a collective space needed to raise, to bring radical to, to where it should be, and not dismiss a lot of just even sound voices as radical. So I think we need for feminist foreign policy, with all the criticism around it, for feminist thinking and feminist spaces to go back to being functional, we need to allow ourselves to be terrorized, to be passionate, to be critical, and to use the spaces available, and to centralize these feelings and activism around it, rather than being pulled out of that space by patriarchy and capitalism that wants us out of it. And it's that feminist reflection is needed in the tiniest activism spaces in our neighborhood, all the way to a feminist policy. So it's really important not to think of it as only at the international level, and go back to practicing it at very, very small spaces, and politicizing spaces, because that's absolutely important, fighting depoliticization.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I would say an important part of kind of building a feminist foreign policy outside of the state is really also about how we organize as activists too. And transnational organizing, I believe, is really critical for this. Understanding each other's struggles in local and various contexts, and understanding how our country or our, wherever we're situated or what we're doing, how that impacts others and how we're all connected. This is important really for collaborating in real solidarity with each other. So I'm thinking about, how people in one country can help dismantle a structure or oppose a structure that creates harm for people in another country. So whether that's arms production and sales that we've talked about, whether it's extractivist industries and the environmental devastation and devastation to communities, whether it's manufacturing corporations and the impacts that they have on environments and on poverty, et cetera, et cetera. I also think solidarity within local context is important too. So, there's a lot of really emerging work here in the United States that is connecting up, folks working against structures of violence in policing and prisons, connecting that to work on borders, connecting that to work on war, the US war machine, how that relates also to the internal war of the United States and the racialized and gendered harms that are reproduced both abroad and at home. So I think that kind of connectivity, collaboration, and solidarity is really key to modeling what feminist foreign policy can and should be.
Kirthi, do you wish to add anything to that?
I think that both of them summed it up very well, but if I must, I would definitely say it's useful to look at what Indigenous women have done for generations. They have practiced feminist foreign policy by resisting everything from colonialism to state extractivism and land grabbing, and continue to do so to this day. Their feminist foreign policy is not tied to the Westphalian conception of the state and actually transcends that. So that's just something I would add to what Ray and Laila said, both of which I agree with fully.
Thank you all so much for sharing your insights on that. We have another question. How do we bring structural violence more prominently into view? It seems that violence, in very limited terms, comes into view only in conflict or war, and policymakers refuse to take structural violence seriously. How should we bring these matters into focus more? Anyone who wants to answer can please jump in. Maybe I can ask Laila to go first. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is there is a lot of advancement in bringing violence to daily conversation, from looking at how our schooling system work, how people, what values do we want to apply in the in different sectors. What Ray mentioned about the police and centering of the policing and what policing works. So I think there is a lot of linking. So linking daily struggles to violence and where is violence situated within them, and looking at all of them as a totality, and how we work on that. And it's the same thinking and the same tactics that work in different places. So I'd go back to local activism, and whether at the board of a school or at the or looking at the media and how violence is portrayed, all these struggles need to be linked, and we need to strengthen local activism and local coordination in order to unify the narrative against violence and make it just linked, not individual incidents and individual fights. It's one towards a more peaceful, dignified space, and that applies for everybody. So what Ray started with about, the hierarchy of victimization and the hierarchy of violence, and which bodies deserve saving and which bodies kind of are expected to be in violence, and countering this in everything we do. I think it's ideologically important to not in a way of saying the sympathy with the horrors happening around Ukraine are not justified. They're justified, they're important, they're absolutely needed. But we need to ask ourselves and ask others about what is causing us to be horrified. And if it didn't horrify us as much in other conflicts, that is fine. That is understandable. We are socialized creatures, but let's reflect on that and make sure that, we acknowledge it and counter it and look at which violence we have been tolerant for and make pledges and take actions to stop being tolerant to violence, to certain violence against certain bodies versus others.
Thank you, Laila. Do you have anything to add to that, Ray?
No, I think Laila covered that very well.
Perfect. So we have time for one more question. So if you could implement a new WPS agenda, what would be the policies you would introduce? What mechanisms, what mechanisms would you implement to guarantee accountability? Maybe Ray, you could take this first, and then Laila.
Yes, I actually thought that what Laila concluded with in her opening presentation is a great answer to this. But I think, from my perspective, from the sort of disarmament, anti-militarism side, I think incorporating that more directly into the Women, Peace and Security framework is really important. It hasn't really been included at all, but really to, if we're serious about protecting people from war, then the structures we need to be putting in place all have to be aimed at preventing war, right? And so that means stopping private production of weapon systems, taking the economic incentive away for war, because war profiteering is, one of the driving forces for armed conflict in the ways that we see it in the world today. The reduction of military spending, the fulfillment of the UN Charter's Article 26, where it was supposed to come up with a plan and a program for reduction of global armaments and constraints on military spending, but taking that to its furthest edge, which is general and complete disarmament, the way that SCRAP pushes for and others do as well. Looking at other structural incentives for conflict and harm and inequality, and in the ways that Laila and Kirthi talked about it in terms of decolonizing the agenda, so important as well. But I wonder, I'm talking about a new framework too, because I don't think it can just be a women, peace and security framework. I think the binaries that we have in this kind of framework are limiting in themselves. And so I think it needs to be much more expansive to include harms to all people, and from a very intersectional place, recognizing, as Kirthi was saying, that there isn't one woman, there's not one way that all women experience conflict. And we also need to get beyond the men-women binary as well. So yeah, so those are a few points that I'd throw out, but I'm sure we could brainstorm a pretty good agenda amongst all of us.
Absolutely.
Perhaps I'll combine this with the last question on whether the UN is salvageable or not. I mean, there are always short answers for these, and I'm very happy to offer my short answer. But I honestly think we need to be very careful in acknowledging the vast spectrum of activism and the importance of all of it. If I say now that I actually think the UN system is unsalvageable, and the only way is in a full transformation, dismantling of a system that is based on colonization and patriarchy and capitalism, and one that is none of that. That's exactly what I believe, but we risk allowing patriarchy to dismiss us as naive. And that's what they want. They want us out because they are the practical, active, give me solutions, give me implementable recommendations. So we need to hang on to our ideological standing, and that's my ideological standing, while highlighting that we support and acknowledge and will work for this diverse and very wide space of activism. So working within the system until we can topple it, thinking how other system could work, and actively every day working to dismantle all of that and creating better realities. But definitely support all the work. As Ray said, it's soul consuming to sit at the table of patriarchy, and the defiance of continuing to take that space there. And I will just use this minute to how hugely fascinated I always am by all the women whose existence in these patriarchal spaces is soul consuming, and they continue to do it. So we need to create this space and that empowerment is okay, that kind of empowerment, so they can continue to exist in these spaces and change them, while we do away with the spaces altogether. So sequence it rightly, and not dismiss any activism as not radical enough or not useful enough. I think it's the spectrum together is what would eventually work.
On that powerful note, we have unfortunately run out of time. As much as we would love to discuss with both of you with all the questions and brainstorm more together. Thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on the webinar. It was our honor to have you on our panel, and we learned so much from you. And thank you so much to the audience as well for joining us. And we invite you to please join us on our next webinar titled Bringing Experiences from Women Practitioners in WPS from the Global South. How do they see the relationship between disarmament and security, which will be happening on Tuesday, April 5th at 2 p.m. BST.
Also, friends, stay up to date with our work and join our newsletter or follow Scrap Weapons on social media. A video recording of this webinar will soon be available on Scrap Weapons YouTube channel. If you're a student and would like to receive a certificate of participation, please feel free to email at scrap.weapons@soas.ac.uk. We will also provide certificates to participants who attend 3 out of 4 webinars of the Feminist Leadership in Disarmament webinar series. Thank you all for your participation. Have a wonderful day.